Thank you very much. Welcome to the fourth session of the HERMAION Vorlesung on May the 5th, and an equally heartfelt welcome to the second thematic block of this lecture series, Wirtschaft, Wert. My name is Anton Emmerich. Thank you very much for the very nice welcome here. And today I would like to talk to you about a topic that has been part of my academic interest for, well, almost a year now. This is the title of my BA thesis, and when I prepared this lecture I was sort of inconclusive whether I wanted to take it just like so, or Be Forever Fallen, Remembering the Revolution in Paradise Lost is a good title, but an equally good title would have been just Falling. Three different kinds, because that is what we are going to talk about today. We're going to talk about three different kinds of falls, and there's one that you see on this cover already. You actually already know this artist from last week. This is Gustave Doré. He engraved some paintings for an edition of Paradise Lost in the 19th century. And as you may remember from Marisa's lecture last week, she actually also used this artist, because I think he's quite famous. This is Satan, as you've seen him last week, falling literally from heaven through earth and into hell, or Lucifer, or however you might refer to him in the text. There are different ways. He's not the only one falling today. Hope it's not me. But other than that, let's get right into it. But before we go in medias res, I want to show you some learning targets. I didn't want to do like a boring old table of contents, so I prepared some learning targets for you. First of all, I obviously want you to become acquainted with one of the most influential poems in the English language, which is Paradise Lost. And I want you to feel more comfortable working with classic literature, which you might have sort of guessed from the introduction. I want you to develop an intuition for the relation of literary and non-literary text, because Paradise Lost is not actually the only text we are going to look at today. And I want you to get to know a literary text as a source for political, social, I might also add cultural, economic, historical analysis. And last of all, take on the challenge of foreign, perhaps strange ideas and concepts, because obviously something that was published in 1667 might not look at things just the same way that we would today. Before we go to Paradise Lost, I want to give you a short introduction. You know that this block is called Wirtschaft, Welt, and this creates this very nice interdependence between Welt and Werk. So a work of art, which today is going to be a poem, but it could just as well be some paintings, as it's going to be next week, or maybe a novel, or whatever, and the Welt, so the environment, the conditions in which it is created. And we can imagine sort of that the environment has an influence on the work of art created, but I want to make a point that the work of art created also has an influence on the environment. Today, obviously, the Welt is the life of Milton himself, and the work is the poem Paradise Lost. And the life of Milton I want to sort of reconstruct analogously to some of the works that he has written over the course of his life. So we're not going to go into detail with all of them, but just a selection would be Areopagitica and Iconoclastus, the Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, and the Ready and Easy Way, which I think sort of very beautifully show a career, literally a career, his life, and how it is influenced by Paradise Lost, and how Paradise Lost is influenced by them. We are going to look at today. My central thesis would be that Paradise Lost is sort of a reckoning. So a reckoning is when you do a calculation, like you have a lot of little calculations over your life, and then at the very end you do one final calculation, and I believe Paradise Lost can be perceived as a reckoning of his life. That's the green arrow, and the red arrow would be that Paradise Lost also paints the life of Milton in maybe perhaps a bit more flattering colors that we would usually see it. So it could be interpreted as a work of nostalgia, of creating a life through the poem itself. Methodology-wise, this is a bit unusual in literary studies. Usually when we do literary studies, we treat the text as separate from its environment. We try to stay within the diegesis, we try to stay within the text and just analyze the text using hints and clues and evidence that we get from the text. And obviously that is not what we are doing here. We are using clues and evidence that we get from outside the text. And this is what New Historicism does, which is to expose, that's the aim, so Harold Wieser is the sort of creator of this theory, to expose the manifold ways culture and society affect each other, and assuming that literary and non-literary texts, so Paradise Lost is a literary text, and the pamphlets that he wrote as non-literary text circulate inseparably. This is ultimately based in a Marxist assumption that the production of culture and literary production of culture is determined by the material conditions of the producer. And the material conditions are the economic state that he is. Is he rich? Is he poor? The political state that he is in, the social state. And all these things influence the way that he writes, or they. This is the methodology introduction block. I'm going to go into Paradise Lost now, but before we do that, just a quick overview of what it is. Paradise Lost is a classical epic. That means it is imitating Greek style, and it is a poem that tells a story. Usually poems don't tell a story, really, they don't have a narrative, but an epic does. And the most famous epics are actually Greek. The Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, you might have heard of them. And Milton sort of tries to imitate this. This also explains the form. For a poem, it's very long, 10,000 lines or more of them, divided into 12 books, which you can sort of imagine as chapters. And when you look at it, it just sort of doesn't really look like a poem. It looks like a regular old novel or whatever. But if you open it up, you see it's written so like a poem. So it's a poem the whole way through. And it is the first narrative poem in the English language that doesn't rhyme, which was so outlandish back when it was published that the publisher had to sort of include an introduction to the poem in which the publisher apologizes that what you are about to read will not rhyme. As it were, the language is very unusual, and even for 17th century it was very unusual and old-fashioned, because Milton uses what we call a Latinate style, a style of language that imitates the Latin language, which he spoke fluently, which means that you have sentences that go on and on and on and on without ever reaching a verb, which sometimes is a bit difficult. One very important point to note is that Milton didn't actually write the poem. He didn't write a single word, a single sentence of the poem. His daughters did, especially Deborah Milton. Milton was blind from the 1650s onwards, which means that he couldn't read nor write. So he had his daughters come to his house every day for the whole day, doing literally unpaid labor, which was sort of forgotten for most of the time. And it is, I find, very embarrassing that Milton Studies hasn't really pinpointed this. So we wouldn't be able to enjoy one of the most astonishing works of English literature if it weren't for this unpaid labor done by women, done by his daughters. So what makes it so special? That would be a lecture in itself. Just condense it into one sentence: things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. It's what Milton says in the very beginning. He wants to create something that is truly epic. You know, in the sense that we use this word today as an adjective. Something that is truly beyond the human imagination. He wants to retell, well, at least in his idea, the most basic story of humankind, which is the creation of humankind, the creation of Adam and Eve, the war in heaven, the fall of Satan, that's fall number 1, tasting from the forbidden fruit, and the fall of man, that's the second fall. And there's a third one in there, but we're going to get to that later. And the question is, why would anyone attempt that if it hasn't been attempted yet? Well, to justify the ways of God to man is what Milton says. So to justify means to explain what God means by all this, to explain to people who don't understand what God means, to make them understand what God actually means by the creation, by everything else. So this is quite, I think, a heavy load. So before we deal with that, actually I'm going to explain to you who Milton was and what he did over his life. So Milton was a public figure. He was a public speaker. Today we would maybe say a public intellectual, so somebody who goes on stage and talks about issues. For him, republicanism, as you will see. And I believe his public life, the life that he spent in public, can be divided into sort of three phases that I call the idealist, realist, and nostalgic phase. And sort of these titles are used to explain tendencies in his writings, motifs or ideas that he has been reusing in his writing in these three phases. So let's start with the idealist phase. This I place about the beginning of the English Civil War. I might need to explain this one. So France was not the first country that beheaded its king. That was actually England. England was in a state where the royalist forces believed that the king had absolute power over England, and the parliamentarian forces, or republican forces, both are sort of equal, believed that parliament held absolute rule over England. So in the one ideology, the king could do what he wanted without asking parliament, and in the other, the king could only do what parliament asked him to do. And obviously these are very opposing forces, and they couldn't be debated no longer, and they were actually, so they manifested in a proper civil war, and ended in the execution of King Charles I in 1649. He was executed for treason against the English people. Milton was sort of at the forefront of these republican people, so of the people who believed that parliament possessed the force. He was not a politician in the exact sense. He was not a member of parliament, but he was sort of someone who wrote pamphlets, who produced propaganda material for the parliamentarian forces. And in this phase, he was characterized, so Löwenstein and Stevens says, by a zealous optimism. So by optimism that sort of all would be good once the kingship was abolished. And the central ideas in his writing yet are liberty and equality, as Christopher Hill says. So that is the beginning of the English Civil War and the beginning of the Republican phase. As you are aware, England is not a republic today. England does have a king, so something must have happened since then. Indeed, the Republican phase didn't last for very long, only about 11 years, before Parliament then decided to bring the king back. So, unlike what you might imagine, the king didn't come, so Charles II, that's Charles I's son, obviously, Charles II didn't come with an army and overtook England, but Parliament basically just voted him in. Parliament voted, we no longer want to be a republic, we want to be a monarchy. Milton was one of those people who didn't trust this tendency, and he wanted to save the republic. He was still very much in favor of the republic and believed that this was the best form of government. And obviously, when he saw that the English nation, as it was in the parliament, was turning against his ideas, and by this, in consequence, also against him, he sort of developed a less idealist, more realist, more toned down, and as Löwenstein says, even agonistic, feindselig relation to what was going on in England. And finally, this nostalgic phase. After the monarchy has been restored and the Republican experiment, as it is sometimes called, has failed, England is a monarchy. Many of the Republican politicians and Republican world leaders have been prosecuted criminally. Milton was also imprisoned, but he later came out of prison because, or at least his biographer says, because the king sort of forgot about him. Milton didn't write political prose anymore. He turned back to poetry. He was a poet before. He wrote some poems when he was young, as a student in university. He turned back to poetry. He sort of stopped participating directly as a person in the political debate, and just sort of stays within his own house, has his daughters, as it were, come to him and sort of communicate his now very nostalgic and distant ideas to the outside. And this is the phase in which Paradise Lost is also written. We are actually going to look at 3 works just to provide some evidence for these phases. The idealist phase I see very much epitomized in this text, The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, where he says that the English nation, the English people, have the honor to precede other nations who are now laboring to be their followers. So England can be a shining example for all other nations in Europe to do as they did, so to abolish the kingships and to become a republic. Obviously, he sees the English people as being like this shining example, this beacon of hope. And in the realist phase, which I see manifested in this text, the ready and easy way to establish a free commonwealth, he says, England will leave no memorial but in the common laughter of Europe. So this is not idealist, where Milton says the English people are so great that other people can follow them, but he says the English people are actually so ridiculous that people will just laugh at them. So you can see it's in just 11 years he has turned quite against his people, basically, against the English people. And then the nostalgic phase, that's Paradise Lost, which is what we are going to look at more detailed, obviously, is where Milton does not participate any longer in the daily politics, but rather says that he may see and tell of things invisible to mortal sight. So of things that are in plain sight and just are, obvious and happen in politics, but go beyond it and see what is really going on. That is what he wants to do in the nostalgic phase. Before we go to there, I actually want to take a drink. I obviously invite you to do the same. John Hill sees nostalgia and Paradise Lost in 4 points. That Paradise Lost should be a poem of national significance, so to speak of something that is not particular but general, epic, if you will. To teach a lesson of the nation, to teach a lesson to the nation, which means to believe that you know something that the other people do not believe. No, to know something that the other people do not know. So, to be understood to be divine truth, so not written by just a human, but in accordance with God. And fourth is actually very similar, to be understood as a result of Milton having a special relation with God, to communicate with God. And the second point is what we are going to look at very deeply now. Paradise Lost should teach a lesson to the nation. What kind of lesson could this poem teach after the Civil War and after the failing of the Republic? What lesson is there to be taught? Well, a lesson of liberty. How to handle liberty, how to achieve liberty, how to stay within liberty. Some evidence here. To display the effects of liberty and tyranny, so these opposing sort of, government structures. And how does he do that? Well, I believe in sort of 3 steps. Anti-monarchism, justified hierarchy, and justified tyranny, which I believe correspond quite well to the phases of his life, to the experiences that he has made over his life. So the anti-monarchist phase, anti-monarchist motif corresponds for me to the idealist phase, where he was still just believing that once you've killed the king, everything's fine. This justified hierarchy, so accepting that there needs to be some sort of hierarchy, corresponds strongly to the realist phase, because in the ready and easy way, as we've seen, he sees the masses as sort of being too stupid to handle freedom, and and being in need of somebody who tells them how to handle freedom. That's the realist phase. And finally, He even says that tyranny is sort of justified in certain instances. One by one, anti-monarchist phase, I chose a quote to correspond to each motif. This is a quote from the third book, quite in the beginning. For regal scepter shall no more need, God shall be all in all, meaning the sort of symbols of power shall be abolished because God is going to be in everybody. And he says, sort of he proves this by saying that God has created all men equal, fair equality, equal state. And that if the king wants to be not equal to the people, then he is sort of sinful. He is a usurper of divine power. As he was created by Parliament, as we've seen, Parliament votes kings in, he has to follow Parliament and not Parliament him. And if he tries to sort of reverse that, he's doing something sinful. Just to give you a little background, I have these cultural context slides. They're not really central to the argument, so if you sort of need some rest, you can do that whenever this appears. But in Renaissance England, there was this belief, or Renaissance Europe more generally, this idea of the great chain of being, so that nature was ordered in one long continuous chain, and that everything that was above in the chain was also more powerful, or must be more powerful. And Milton sort of interprets this politically as a relation between creator and creation. So since God creates Satan, that means that God is above Satan. Parents create their children, that means parents are more powerful than their children. Parliament creates the king by voting them in, that means Parliament is more powerful than the king, just as a background. And if Parliament imposes rules on the king, that is not a restriction of power, that is actually an empowerment in itself, but an empowerment of the right side, of the right and not the wrong. So, anti-monarchism. Let's go on to the justified hierarchy motif. Book 5, by steps we may ascend to God. Just a quick setting. Book 5 is a catalogue, basically. So the 5th chapter, the archangel comes to Adam and Eve and basically explains them what is going on, Archangel Michael. And this is very helpful if you want to sort of research cultural or political backgrounds from that time, because it's literally written like a catalogue. So Adam asks a question, Michael gives an answer, Adam reacts, Adam asks the next question. And so you get through a whole lot of topics in a very short time. And Michael says, by steps we may ascend to God, so we are not all equally close to God, but we are in steps. And this is a hierarchy. Very basically, if you have steps, that means there are some people who are further away and some people who are closer, and that is a hierarchy. And Milton is not opposed to hierarchy, just as long as it is based on merit rather than birth. The king says, I am powerful because I am born a king. And Milton hates that. He says, you can be powerful if you merit, so if you deserve your power. And he says so in this quote quite beautifully, by merit more than birthright, Son of God. So he says, Jesus Christ is not actually Son of God because he is born the Son of God, but because he merited, he deserved to be Son of God. And Satan claims to deserve power, just like the king, just because he's Satan. And the king says, I deserve power just because I'm the king, without ever having done anything for it. And that is something that Milton is quite strongly opposed to, because he says liberty, as like the ultimate power, is merited, it is earned, not gifted, not just granted, not just given. And this last leitmotif, we have justified tyranny, which is, I think, the most weird one. Let me serve in heaven God ever blessed and his divine behests obey, worthiest to be obeyed. He says, tyranny is the form of government that the man after the fall from Eden needs. True liberty is lost. And he sees that in the time of the Republic, when there wasn't tyranny, but a Republican phase, people abused this freedom, abused this liberty, not to be closer to God, which would be the right use of liberty, but just to sin the more freely. Because now the government was weak enough that they could do all the sinful stuff. And this is quite a weird argument, I find. And because it is so weird, I'm actually going to look at it more closely. But before we do that, little drink. Okay, what will now follow is the only sort of deep reading phase, so the only longer quote that we get from Paradise Lost. Do not be deterred, it is not that long, we're going to get through that together. I provide a translation for it, no worries. So, this is from Book 12, near the end. This setting. Book 12 is after Adam and Eve have eaten the apple and fallen from Eden. And they are let out of paradise by the Archangel Michael, which is actually what is on the cover of my edition. And they stand before Earth and they see how terrible it is and how bad it is in comparison to Eden. And Michael sort of gives them a speech on what will happen next. So their immediate future and the immediate future of mankind. And he's talking about Nimrod. The name doesn't appear in this quote, but it is in there. And Nimrod is, in biblical tradition, the first human to be called king by other humans. And Adam is quite horrified by the idea of Nimrod being a king. And Michael provides this answer. Justly thou abhorrest that son who on this quiet state of men such trouble brought, affecting to subdue rational liberty. Yet know withal, since thy original lapse, true liberty is lost, which always with right reason dwells twinned, and from her hath no individual being. So, you are right to find Nimrod horrible, because he takes away your freedom. But you should be aware, you have already lost the greater part of your freedom through the fall. That freedom that you had always been connected to your consciousness of God's truth. So the quintessence of this section is, you have lost access to God's truth by yourself. That is not the king's fault. That is your own fault. That is already quite accusing, but it gets worse. A little later he says, God in judgment just subjects him from without to violent lords, who oft as undeservedly enthrall his outward freedom. Tyranny must be, though to the tyrant thereby no excuse. Again, Nimrod and the kings that succeed him were created by God to take away your freedom. Because after the fall, the only possible form of government is tyranny. However, the tyrant cannot simply do what he wants, but must follow divine law himself. So this quintessence is even stronger. Tyrants, kings, are created by God, specifically for the reason of being tyrants. And I thought, what is going on? We have this long poem, and he tells us throughout the whole poem that tyrants are bad, and kings are bad, and anti-monarchism, and liberty is good, and we must free ourselves from these monarchs. And then very near the end, so here, he tells us, actually they're created by God, and that's the reason they exist. This is very weird, because Milton has used his whole lifetime to talk about how bad kings are, and this was published in 1667. He died 7 years later. So near the end of this book and his life, he suddenly, oh well, kings are also part of God's creation. You might ask the same that I did ask, which was, is Milton an idiot? He contradicts himself, doesn't he? He is sort of like Satan, because there is an analysis of Paradise Lost, which is quite handy, called A Preface to Paradise Lost by C.S. Lewis, whom we of course know as the author of
The Chronicles of Narnia.
Very good, The Chronicles of Narnia. But he was also a Milton scholar, fun fact. And he writes of Satan that Satan one day wants hierarchy and the next day does not want hierarchy. And Milton seems to be the same. He is like Satan. He is a liar. Is he? Well, okay, we sort of need to deal with this now, because it might not surprise you that this answer does not satisfy me, and I don't think it should satisfy you. So, let's start over. Fortunately for us, we are not actually the first people to come across this contradiction. And there is a very handy explanation by this man, Christopher Hill, who was a Marxist historian at Balliol College, Oxford, and describes this contradiction as the dialectic of discipline and liberty. Just about Christopher Hill. Christopher Hill was, generally speaking, a pro-Miltonite. He sorts Milton into a special kind of social movement that is known as proto-socialism. So socialism before it was a word. He has the book that I heavily rely on in my analysis here is written by Christopher Hill and is called Milton and the English Revolution, which is obviously also the title of my lecture, The English Revolution. English Revolution is not a very neutral term. The neutral term would be English Civil War. English Revolution already shoehorns all that has happened in and frames it in a special way, because revolution is a socialist idea. And Christopher Hill believes that Milton was a socialist, basically. There are very good reasons for that not being true, but for the time being, we are going to stay within his argument. So, what is the most central idea or question of Paradise Lost? The question is, where does evil come from? And where does evil come from is a very difficult question indeed. For Christianity, as Carrie says, but I think for all of human history, it has been one of the most interesting questions. And another sort of cultural context slide here is theodicy. It's another difficult word. If you translate it, it doesn't really help, because the German translation of theodicy is just Theodice, and that doesn't tell us anything either. Theodicy just means to explain or sort of to apologize God for the existence of evil. Christianity understands God as both omnipotent and omnibenevolent. Omnipotent means all-powerful, and omnibenevolent means all well-meaning. And with that in mind, it is quite difficult to explain how evil can exist. Because if it was not created by God, because he's omnibenevolent, he can't be omnipotent. If it was created by him, because he's omnipotent, he can't be omnibenevolent. That is a very difficult contradiction, and Milton sort of finds an answer to that also very neatly fits into his idea of liberty. And that is what we are going to look at now. The answer that he provides is attempting to be equal with gods, aspiring to be such. So the fact that humans try to be like God is the origin of evil. Okay. The sin is not the fact that Adam and Eve went to a tree where apples grew, took an apple, and ate it. Because, believe it or not, that was just an apple tree. That was just an apple. An apple is not magic. It is just a fruit. There is no evil in an apple. An apple is an apple. But the fact that they specifically went to that tree and took an apple and ate it is evil because they were told not to do it. The fruit does not contain knowledge of evil. The fact that you decide to eat it, even though you know that you shouldn't, contains evil. Okay, so ultimately, the knowledge of evil lies within the liberty of deciding what to do, in the free will, basically.
Can you please?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. Okay, we need to deepen this a bit, I believe. After humans have fallen from the Garden of Eden, from paradise, they have lost paradise. They have realized that it is an option not to obey God. Before that, they didn't know that. They thought you just have to obey God because He is God. But they have now realized you can actually do something else. And Milton describes this, and this is a bit difficult, as a shift from intuitive to discursive rationality. So intuitive rationality means to just know what is right just because God says it. And discursive rationality, to discuss means to discuss, means to be able to discuss things and to see them from different angles. And actually, he believes that humans have to do that because they now know that you can also see it a different way. Before that, they didn't know that. Just cultural context here, I want to tell you about this text, Areopagitica, which you see is quite early, 1644. That was a speech written by Milton to the English Parliament. He didn't deliver it, he wasn't a member of Parliament, he wrote it in a pamphlet and distributed it amongst the members of Parliament. And in the speech Areopagitica, he speaks out against censorship and for free speech. And why does he do so? Well, because the basis of his concept of human understanding is discursive knowledge. It is defined by uncertainty. You don't know what is true and what is not true. You have to debate that. You have to let people come forth with their opinion of what is true and let them freely debate because you don't no longer know what is true. And you have to, Stavely calls this very beautifully in a sort of a picture, recollection of truth. So sort of a mosaic. Everybody has sort of a piece of what is true, but you need to set that together into one bigger picture. And if you have restrictions on that, like censorship, that obviously restricts also the recollection of truth. No one knows what is true and what is not true, and that includes the king. If the king doesn't know what is truth, he cannot also say, I only let these people speak and these people not. Just if it of any interest where this weird title comes from, Areopagitica, some of you may have some knowledge of antiquity. The Areopagus was a hill in Athens where the Athenian parliament met. And the Athenian parliament wasn't elected, it was chosen at random of all Athenian citizens. So this idea of an open forum where everybody, no matter their social position, in brackets, if they are not slaves or women, can speak, that is what Milton wanted to evoke here. Areopagitica in reference to the Areopagus. Yeah. And very quick, this very beautiful sentence from Paradise Lost: freely they stood who stood and fell who fell. So everybody who wants to remain with God, to stand, can do so, but everybody who does not want to do that can also just fall freely if they want to. Yeah. The last point on this is, if you know what is right or wrong because you sort of can piece it together, then that also makes you accountable, at least in theory, for your actions. Reason is also a choice, You are always free to recognize the truth of God and to do the things that are true. But if you recognize it and you don't do that, you do something else, then you are accountable for being evil. And if you do not recognize this, then you are doomed to repeat the same mistake. Which mistake? Well, falling, obviously. That is what this lecture is about. Satan fell, we've seen that on the cover slide, from heaven through earth and into hell. Because he didn't want to be a subject to God, because he believed, I'm just as good. Adam and Eve fell, because they thought, why do I have to listen to God's law? And the English nation fell. Why did they fall? Well, they found it to be quite difficult to handle discursive knowledge. Freedom, liberty, is hard work, is what Milton is telling us. It is very difficult, it is very strenuous to go and debate everything. It is very difficult to talk things through. It is very difficult to approach people and see their angle, accept their angle. It is much more easy if you just have somebody tell you what is right or wrong. So tyranny must be, in the way that I understand it, does not mean Milton believes that tyranny should happen, but it is his analysis of what unfortunately did happen. Because the English people, in the very end, they wanted to have a tyrant, because that is easier. So, we are near an end, actually. I have some take-home messages for you. The first is, do not be scared of working with classic literature. Obviously, old language is intimidating, but the feeling of having mastered it is very, very rewarding, I can tell you that. And the feeling of being able to say, well, I've read Paradise Lost, that is very rewarding indeed. Then life has not changed much in 350 years. Feeling disenfranchised by an all-powerful state, seeing that people around you are being oppressed by dictators, I think that is something that we can all agree on is happening right now. And literature is also a way to understanding politics, economy, and society, because art is never separate from the condition in which it is created and can actually tell us a lot about the conditions in which it is created. Yeah, there we go.